right, cool. Well, thank you for coming to my talk today. This talk is on a consensus architecture that we've been working on for, I don't know, probably the last 3 months or so. Steven and I have been digging away at this one. And so I wrote this long post about it online, which I tried to make as readable as I could, but admittedly there's a lot going on here. And so I thought this would be a really good talk to give, just to explain everything about where this came from start to finish, similar to what I did with Rick's a few months ago, with the hope that people can at least understand what it is, and if it's interesting, potentially contribute to it. We don't have it implemented yet or anything like that, so also if you have any feedback, certainly interested in that. So I'm battling a little jet lag, so bear with me if I forget to say something, or if I say something confusing, please raise your hand and ask a question. But with that, I will get going. So today I'm talking about Vena, continuing my naming streak in the V category. Today we're talking about optimistically responsive consensus over large validator sets. So when you're working on consensus stuff, it's very important to use the right terminology, which was fun to learn as well. What that really means is, can I take a large validator set, so let's just say 500 or more validators, and robust, so like, is it live and safe up to f less than n over 3 Byzantine faults, and can I make that snappy, so what we'll say like a second finality. So snappy here is usually defined as moving at network speed in some way with hopefully not too many hops, but I'll get into all this. So, but just to motivate things, let's take a few steps back, because why do we want this thing? Don't we already have it, or do we not have it, or what's our current situation? So when I first joined Avalanche back in 2021, after mainnet launch, so you never late, I wrote this thread about leaving Coinbase. And so when I got to the part talking about why I was joining Avalanche, there were 3 things that really I felt were important at that time, and I still feel are important today. So the first one is that I felt general smart contracting in some form with some form of composability was very important. I thought scale through loosely connected but clearly distinct subspaces, or subnets we call them. And then lastly was this desire to have thousands of people to serve as block producers or full participants in consensus. Now, at that time, and honestly still today quite a bit, people have, I think, focused less on that last point to either make consensus faster or to make things cheaper or whatever, what have you. But if we're really trying to build like a step forward in internet architecture, I never really thought it was feasible that you could have that rely on 20 participants, 100 participants. That just seemed kind of wild to me. And so the ability to secure things or have consensus that runs over many thousands of participants was, at least to me at that time, super appealing. And like many of you, I got nerd sniped by this paper, which was the original Avalanche paper. The thing that really stuck out to me, and probably stuck out to many other people, was instead of taking the traditional PBFT route, an entirely different approach was proposed using repeated subsampling. And this was, a whole new direction to go. Over the last few years, there's been a number of different research papers that have dropped analyzing its security, also different suggestions for ways it could be improved. But at the core of it, there was a way to have thousands of participants in consensus and still finalize decisions very, very quickly without having massive network complexity. So in practice, typically a message will send, or a node will send about 400 messages per consensus round, assuming that it's not pipelined. Steven, feel free to correct me at any time. And that scales pretty nicely regardless, even in the thousands of participants. But that trade-off is, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you probably already all know this, but the one trade-off is the liveness bound. So in the paper, it's called out, there's a square root n bound, or point at which liveness begins to degrade in the network. So for people that are trying to launch a robust consensus system, you may say, yeah, it's great that you can go fast and you can have a lot of participants, but people can hit, a third resilience. Why does it have to stop at, square root n? So, we at Avalanche were aware of this, and so a few months ago we released a paper called Frosty. I have the QR code up there. I know generally not supposed to put QR codes up, so Jens, don't look at this. But I think that link is good as long as Google's not hacked right now. And so what this was about was finding ways to take the fast path that Snow offers and then have a fallback mechanism that falls back to maybe a less efficient but more robust in terms of liveness mechanism to potentially restore the network back to the fast path. So the idea that you would never operate for a prolonged period of time in the slow path, but entering this slower, infrequent path could allow you to do something that would let you operate in this faster path. Now, this was a really interesting experience to go through. Certainly working with Andy Lewis Pye was really fun. He certainly has a lot of interesting ideas and definitely incorporated them into this paper. But in this paper, it should, I think with more work we can get it closer to n over 3. But at least in this paper we focus on n over 5 liveness. And still there's a lot going on here. So, we're in this fast path with Snow. Then we have this transition protocol, which is a whole nother mechanism, and then another mechanism for PBFT, and then you can move back. It doesn't give you native consensus artifacts out of the box because it still relies on Snow consensus predominantly. And so if you wanted to have something like acceptance proofs, which is currently listed under ACP 75, you'd have to have another mechanism. So this was really fun to work on, really cool, but while we were working on it, I kept coming back to this question of, okay, this is what we want. We're taking Avalanche consensus, making it better with all these extra components. But what if instead we took all of our learning over the last few years and just said, what if we approached the problem with a fresher start and said, if we just were to say, maybe take some of the great ideas of Snow, the great ideas of Frosty, some of the other consensus work we've done, and try to put them together maybe in a different way. And so, I don't know if you can read this or not, I love this meme, but this is all I worked on for a few months, got pretty obsessed, as Stephen can attest. A lot of loops of feedback, many wrong things I did that I think we turned them into right things. But was really interested in finding a way to achieve the same property, maybe in a totally different way. And not to say that one's better or worse than the other, but just if we looked at it totally differently, what could we get maybe with some of the latest consensus research on the original track of the PBFT route. So it all started earlier this year, actually in January. So we're one of the sponsors of IC3, which is a consensus research group, and just generally blockchain research, I guess. And they had an event in Switzerland, which I don't need any excuse to go to Switzerland, and that was definitely a good one. And so we went there. I presented VRIX for the first time, which I tried to fit an hour-long presentation into an 8-minute presentation. Did not go as well as you would have thought, or maybe as well as you would have thought. And then, but someone else was there, another student from Cornell Tech. His name was Ben Chan, and he presented a consensus paper that I had never heard of before called Simplex Consensus, and so there's a link to this here. And it stuck out to me because after the presentation, unlike many other consensus presentations I had heard of, I was like, well, I think I could actually implement that, which was crazy because, you look at all these papers, and you're like, the algorithm block is like 3 pages long. You're like trying to understand the security proofs. But Simplex, I thought, brought a certain elegance to things without really sacrificing performance. Now, Simplex, though, is still a all-to-all multicast protocol. So, out of the box, you shouldn't expect to use it on like a Avalanche-sized network. But the core ideas were super interesting. Now, I'm not going to work you through a lot of the consensus proofs here and their nuance, but the simplicity is really a leader takes a block, sends it to every other participant. As soon as every other honest participant sends back a vote, and they collect 2/3 plus 1 votes, they then proceed to the next round, do it again, and then asynchronously out of the round itself, vote to finalize. So that's it. Now the trick is in the case where you don't get 2/3 by some period of time, and in which case you fall back to this all-to-all broadcast. So instead of most consensus systems where you will have at a particular height many rounds of consensus, or you'll rely on the leader or like consecutive honest leaders to finalize something, instead Simplex takes the approach where if you just can't finalize something at a height because either there's not enough online participants, not enough honest participants, or the network is degrading, you just give up on that height and move forward. Now you can potentially finalize at some point the block that you skipped finalizing at an earlier height, but generally it's a little bit simpler, and as a result, you don't need any like consecutive honest leader assumptions, and you ended up getting this like very simple, in my opinion, structure that you can work with. Now, I thought this was interesting because it natively blended this like fast path and then fallback path that Frosty had, but within a single environment. Now, the issue, obviously, is just this multicast or like all-to-all broadcast. So, this is where we might get a little bit heavier into some of the math. So Simplex is aware of this. Ben actually used to work at Algorand. At Algorand, one of the things they really like to do is subsample the committee of voters. So, if you can't have everyone participate, if you, have some proof, if you take so many participants in, that you can have some certainty around safety bounds, even if you don't have everybody there, and find a way, okay, we have 10,000 participants. If we take in, for example, 100 and they run consensus, what's the probability that we pull in, more than the representative share of Byzantine participants in that sample? You can bound it in some math, which if you want to read it, you can check it. But what ends up happening is that if you want very high safety bounds, the number of participants you have to draw from is very large. So I ran the numbers at least to get like close to 1/3 safety bounds, and you end up having to pull in about 5,000 participants. And so for some of the more important consensus operations in Algorand, they end up having these huge subsamples. But in practice, they don't end up being a huge issue because you have this thing called party aggregation where like if you have a node with multiple votes, you can kind of combine those votes, so there may be many less nodes participating than 5,000. But generally speaking, if you need a subsample and let's say that's not the case, it doesn't really solve your problem. So you still have fundamentally this issue of having to sample a ton of participants to get the safety bounds. So what if we don't do that? And then the other thing which has happened over the last few years is ETH2 has adopted this thing called aggregation committees, which no one knows where any of these things come from, but I would definitely say that they popularized it. And the idea is that over one epoch, I believe that they call it, every validator attests to a block at least once. And the way that they do this, if they have like 1 million validators, they obviously can't all communicate at once. They're broken into these aggregation committees. There can be multiple committees per block, and then you may have a leader or two in that aggregation committee that will collect a BLS multi-signature, similar to what we do for warp messaging, and then include that attestation in the block, such that even a particular epoch, everyone should be voting for something, and so then after 2 epochs, you can finalize everything. That's the whole consensus design. But this notion of having these, like, they also use the word subnet, which it is kind of from a messaging perspective, and then aggregating messages to then avoid having everyone talk to everyone is a cool idea. So Vena, in some way, is combining some ideas from Simplex and then some ideas from aggregation committees to hopefully bring everything together. So Vena is broken into 2 parts, the happy path and what's called the recovery path. You can, and I'll get to this in a bit, but you want to parameterize Vena so that you almost always stay in the happy path. But it's important that if you exit the happy path, you can efficiently and quickly recover. Because if it turned into some crazy situation, I think it's a lot less interesting. So the way it works is that when you're a leader, you have a block, you'll broadcast it to participants that are assigned to different aggregation committees. So like the leader will only have to send a message to the number of aggregation committees there are. All of these are parameters that you can tune. And then in each aggregation committee, there's some number of aggregators that then may send that block to participants. Now, when you go into the vote phase, what will happen is that the participants, once they get that block, will send their vote to the aggregator, and then the aggregator will collect signatures, and then once they reach a certain threshold, they'll then pass that message to other aggregators that are in different aggregator committees, and then pass that to their participants once they've collected 2/3 signature weight, basically. And this itself, you're like, okay, well, what that means is that one hop to the aggregator, one hop to the participant, and then from the participant back to the aggregator to other aggregators back to the participant. You're like, all right, there's kind of a lot of hops here. Like, how does this, really fit into things? And we'll talk about that later in terms of actually what the network speed is as a result of that. But you can see that there's very much not a focus on like some single party having to talk to everybody or like some phase where everyone talks to it, unless things are falling apart. And so in the case where the aggregators, or for some reason, participants are not collecting 2/3 plus 1 votes, I've gotten feedback that this is an overly complicated image for what it is, and that's just that everyone sends to everybody their vote. And the vote that they send is not for any particular block, but just to skip this height, similar to how Simplex has this ability to skip. Similar to Frosty, how like if things are not working, you fall back to a more expensive recovery process. Now, in practice, again, you should never hit this, but in the case that you do, it's one mechanism. There's no like separate mechanism you have to transition to, and then in that transition path do something else. It's all part of the same engine. So if you want to see exactly what the spec looks like, it's on the original blog post, but I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of to give you some more specific idea of how it all works. Because in my opinion, although there's like some, 18 steps or so I think I wrote, I don't think it's actually that hard to reason about once you get the general idea of what's going on. So because this is a model in the partially synchronous network model, we assume that there's this phase of GST, which I'm not going to go through all this right now, actually. I'll just talk about the protocol. But the idea is that you want to set 2 timers. So the first timer is really to say, hey, I haven't heard about a block yet. Maybe I'll just give up on that and start to vote empty block right away. And then the second timer is, oh, I haven't heard about a notarization yet. I'm just going to start to send to everybody. So first thing you do, you compute a random shuffle of the validators at a particular height. So, imagine you just have one long array. You randomly order it. Let's just say that the first item in that array is the leader. So we'll call that, leader H. And then we're going to shuffle again for the validators at the next height. And I'll explain why this is important later. But so for each committee, we select, who the aggregators are going to be. This is, again, configurable. Maybe for each committee you want one aggregator. Maybe you want a few aggregators. There's a lot of math you can do to figure out kind of what robustness you're targeting, and that's how many aggregators you want. And then you want to select the committee participants. Basically, everyone else, it's just a minor participant here. And then, we just define all aggregators. So if you're the leader, pretty straightforward. You build a block, and you send that to all the aggregators. Cool. That's all that says. Now, if you're an aggregator and you receive a block from the leader, you'll pass that to all the participants in your committee. Now, someone following along closely will note, well, what if you have multiple aggregators? Yes, they could all send you the same block. And I think I've noted this as future work for at least you could potentially make this more efficient if you wanted to. But that's an important part to make sure it's robust, and that if you have everyone but you is dishonest aggregator, that the participants there all get the block. So great, all the participants have the block, and we'll skip down to what they do later. But imagine that you're the aggregator. Great, I've sent the block, I've done my job. Now I'm going to wait. So now I want to wait for some amount of signature weight from the participants before I start to aggregate that message and send it to everybody else. So this is what we call the intermediate or the initial signature broadcast weight, IB. And so usually, we give you a simple analogy. So if we just had a timer, for example, we would not move at network speed. So you don't want to use like a timer to say, oh, after the first 300 milliseconds, I'll send what I've got. Because what if the network connection you're on moves faster than that? You want to move at that speed. So this was one of Stephen's contributions, which we call delta signatures. And so the idea is that you collect some amount of weight from the participants in your group. Let's say it's 66% or 33% or whatever. Once you get that initial amount of weight, you start to send that to the other aggregators. Now, this is something that you can tune so that if you want to have more robustness, you'll just send more delta signatures, and that just means you send more messages. But you can break this down into what we call the initial vote broadcast and then the delta vote broadcast. So let's say you send let's just do a simple one where maybe you send your first signature at 50% weight, and then every 10% weight after that, you send another one. Now, that may be aggressive tuning, but you can imagine kind of how you could take that. When the aggregator gets 2F+1 votes, they then take that and send that to all their participants, and at that time, the participants then move into the next round. Pretty standard. And then there's a whole similar step for voting on finalize. Like I said, that's like a separate part of the protocol, so it doesn't slow down while you're waiting for finalize. It'll move right to the next phase. And then as a participant, same thing, kind of the other half of the aggregator. You get the block, you vote. Once you get the votes, you then decide if you want to finalize. And then most importantly, if at any point these timers fire, so those timers we talked about at the beginning, you'll start to do this optimistic like dummy block vote where first, if you haven't seen a block, instead of sending to everybody right away when you vote for your dummy block, you'll send it to the aggregators to say, hey, maybe just the leader was dishonest. We don't need to enter an all-to-all broadcast. We'll just use the aggregator and save the bandwidth. But if even after that you don't hear about like a notarization, you'll then send it to everybody directly. So this is a way to prevent like some dishonest leader from forcing all-to-all broadcasts, which would suck. So pause there. A lot of context. So hopefully the recording will be useful to go back and read over it. But with simplex, I think the really important thing to note is that if you read the simplex paper, you should understand that adding aggregation committees is really it's really a multicast implementation that is efficient but changes in some way like the expected time for messages to travel through the network, but hopefully shouldn't really impact the security or liveness or safety or liveness proofs. So, cool. What's most important, let's back up, how does it perform? So, to take a step back, let's talk first about simplex, which is this should be the most performant. So we're just gonna say that. And we're not trying to match the performance of this because we're trying to be more efficient on the network side. So the way you typically refer to these is just as little delta, which you can assume to be the true network speed. So let's say that this is just like one point-to-point message. So I don't know, in practice, this is maybe something like 100 milliseconds for most things. So let's say that, for the leader to send a message to all the participants, 100 milliseconds, cool. For them to vote and send that to everyone else, another 100 milliseconds. So, and then for them to finalize, another 100 milliseconds. So if everything's good, everyone's online, you're okay with the message, this will finalize really fast. And that's very clearly documented in the paper and really cool. So you're like, wow, that's awesome. If only it was more network compatible with a larger validator set. So in Vena, on the optimistic path, so this is without the recovery, what this looks like is it again moves at network speed. You would get a block notarization in 5 little delta, which is about, in a happy path, you would expect about 500 milliseconds, and then finalization in 800 milliseconds. And you get the artifacts of consensus directly out of it, which is like this multi-signature over the block, which is something you could pass over warp messaging, or you could use it for a light client or something like that. Some things we don't have with Snowman today, which are cool. Now, again, most people, you like move blocks typically at the notarization step. So like you probably wouldn't want to move much faster than this because you may be doing like Merkle root generation every block. So you probably don't want to go too much faster than that. But let's just, to compare it to Snowman, at the same thing, assuming we have the parameters that we use on mainnet today, these are still the current parameters, right? Assuming the way that the nodes discover a block is they'll be randomly polling for people's preferences. And so let's just say we assume we just heard about a block in the first poll. So this is one little delta out, one little delta back. And then we do 4 concurrent polls at once. So 20 divided by 4, so 5 polls. This ends up being about 12 little delta to finalize. So compared to what we currently do with Snowman, which at least in practice performs really well and we think is really cool, just for notarization, it's less than half the time. And then for finalization, I think it's about 25% faster. Plus you get all these consensus artifacts, and it has tolerance up to higher liveness failure. So now you're like, okay, well, what do you pay for, right? So the thing that Avalanche consensus is really good at is message complexity. So first, let's look at simplex. I don't know if you guys can see this. Shoot. All right. It's all in the thing online. But so let's just say that you get 2,048 validators. In that case, the leader is going to send 6,000 messages out, and it's going to collect 8,000 messages. Each participant is going to send 6,000 out and take 6,000 in. Not maybe what you want. Vena, it's a little bit more complicated because there's like more roles here. But in the happy path, where you have 2,048 validators, let's say that the committee size is 32, you have one aggregator per committee, you're going to send way less than simplex. In fact, a very reasonable amount, especially if you're a participant, which is almost everybody, which is 3 messages out, 2 messages in. If you're an aggregator, a couple hundred, not too bad. A leader, just to the aggregated committees. In the same example, but with more aggregators, which is useful for more robustness, you can see how the numbers will go up. So this is maybe a very optimal case. This may be more of a realistic case. Now you'd say, all right, well, how does that compare to Snowman again? In this model where we have k equals 20, you do 20 polls, assuming everything is successful, that's about 400 messages per participant. So in Vena, in the optimistic case, every participant is less in this aggressive case, and then in the more realistic case, the aggregators, which are very few, or like a couple hundred nodes, everyone else is much less than what they currently do in Snowman consensus. So how does this all work in terms of practice? You can trade robustness for communication complexity. So the real important lever here is how many aggregators are in each committee. Because you can imagine, let's say you have a committee of 32 people and your aggregator's dishonest. Well, now the participants are not going to get the block, or their vote won't go through, or they won't get like the message back from the network. So we made this chart where Byzantine participation percentage across the network is on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is how many samples, when you randomly do this over 10,000 times, how many are successful, aka like how many times does a quorum certificate get formed and distributed to enough nodes. And you can see we break this down by, it's kind of hard to see on this presentation, but again, it's in that write-up. If you have the initial broadcast versus the delta broadcast for a fixed number of aggregators. So you can see that in the case where you have one aggregator, things with a very conservative, or I guess more aggressive, I should say in this case, initial broadcast and delta broadcast start to break down very quickly. But most things break down, maybe around the 15% mark. Now, if you instead take the other side of the spectrum and let's say 8 aggregators per committee, it looks very different. And so you only get things to break down in the aggressive case at like 20%, and then otherwise you can go all the way up on the mark. So you would say, well, we probably don't want to like sit in one. It feels like if the network is pretty stable, you'd want to drift down here because this is most message efficient. And then if things are unstable, you'll probably want to increase your message complexity to tolerate that. So that's really cool, right? Because instead of having to do all these messages to everyone all the time, if most people are online and the network's good, why are we sending all these extra messages? And maybe it doesn't work one time, no problem. We do one larger broadcast and then immediately start to use these aggregation committees, but with more robustness. And so I'm going to skip this slide because this is going to be impossible to read. But you can see for aggregators, as you tune the delta broadcast, given different aggregators and initial broadcast weight, the number of messages can go up quite a bit or down quite a bit. And so there are a lot of scenarios where you may not want to tune Vena in a certain way, but all of this code for like tuning is available online for you to check out. Like for example, you probably wouldn't want to tune it in a way where like the number of messages an aggregator would send would be far more than like simplex ever would have been, because you should have just done all broadcasts then. But there are many interesting cases where it doesn't get anywhere close to that. So that's the high-level description of things. And so the future work is, first off, I kind of walk through what I will call like a elongated protocol sketch. And so the next thing we're working on is working on formal proofs of correctness and liveness. So hopefully we can take things from the simplex paper and extend them without much fear that we're going to commit some sort of violation. The next thing is actually really cool, which is streamlining. So instead of sending finalize as a separate message, you can instead put the finalize message on the vote message for the next round and just cut the message complexity in half. If you're willing to accept a little longer latency of finalization. So if you really wanted to tune, let's say, things to be really robust, and we're okay accepting a little more latency, maybe something closer to what Snowman currently gets, you could get really interesting performance from the message complexity side. The one that I actually think is the coolest part of this whole thing was this idea that Stephen and I came up with where you can dynamically adjust the size of the aggregation committee out of consensus. So the biggest issue, right, is if you need to agree over changes to the message parameterization, or like how you send messages through the network, and you can't achieve consensus because you're tuned too aggressively, you're kind of screwed because there's no way to recover. And so the way that this works is instead pretend that you give everybody a rank in your committee, maybe even up to 32, but you'd probably stop at like 16 or something, or maybe even 2/3. And every node decides on its own, based on its observation of network conditions, how far down the rank it's going to send its messages to. So let's say that I've seen things be pretty stable. I'm only going to send it to the first aggregator. Maybe someone else in my committee, though, they came from a few other committees that were fucked. So they're going to send it to 16 people. Because of the Delta signature broadcast, what will happen is that if rank 16 only gets like 5 votes, they're not going to forward that to anybody. But maybe everyone thinks the network is in a pretty bad space and they get above the initial broadcast weight, then they'll forward it to all aggregators up to their equivalent rank in other committees. So you get this really nice property of the network being able to gracefully recover, even if it can't come to any actual decisions, which I think makes this a very practical thing to deploy. And then lastly, this was another contribution from Stephen, is that you could stack these aggregation committees if you really wanted to add more participants, but at the same time, you will lose a little bit of latency in the process. This is also something that the Ethereum community is exploring for scaling up their message distribution network. And so, to leave you with something, there's no right way to do consensus. There's a lot of different ways to do it based on what your trade-offs are, the sizes, the latencies, everything like that. Unfortunately, I think the space sometimes goes into this way of trying to say this is the right way, or we've made consensus better for everyone, or whatever. I think that there's just a lot to consider. And so as a result, on the initial roadmap, we published this box, way out, configurable subnet consensus algorithms, which is that subnets also have different needs, and we think that over time there'll be a lot of different choices to make related to what your goals are, and that we hope Vena, for example, or even directly simplex, could be interesting choices that you as a subnet could choose to use that are more compatible with what you want to do. So, for example, if you expect almost everyone to be honest, or you're not as concerned about liveness trade-offs, and you really like what, obviously Avalanche is pretty battle tested over the years, you could just use that. But now maybe you want, maybe you only have a subnet of 100 people and you want consensus artifacts, maybe you'll use your traditional PBFT. Maybe you want a really big subnet and you want consensus artifacts, or you like what Vena is, you could do something like this. So yeah, it's been, that was pretty quick. Hopefully you understood half of that. If not, I'll, answer any questions now. But that's it, yeah.